Welcome to the Hay Kings podcast, brought to you by Krone, dedicated to hay and forage producers. Today on the podcast, I'm joined by one of our regular participants, Jeffrey Alfalfa Jackson. We're also joined by Dr. Erica Rodbell. She's the Forage Research Agronomist with Forage Genetics International. Her background is entomology, so today we're going to talk about some alfalfa pests. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, John, for having me. This is an honor for me to be here. And I'm excited to dive into the deep end of the swimming pool with you all when it comes to pest management and alfalfa.
John, I don't know if she understands what she just said. It can get deep on here.
Oh boy. Yes, it can. Erica, let's talk about some of the work that you've done.
Absolutely. Right at the top here, I joined Forage Genetics International about 6 months ago. But prior to that, I was research assistant, right, through Montana State University for my PhD work. And it was focused on mapping alfalfa weevil pyrethroid resistance across the Intermountain West. And I understand that for your listeners, this is something that is a concern for them and something that may be of interest as to figure out what they can do to protect themselves from this issue, and if they have this issue, what they can do to solve it.
I am so excited about this podcast, Erica, because this pest has probably been my worst nightmare in the alfalfa industry for my entire career. And for some people east, when we say alfalfa weevil and talk about alfalfa pests, they go, what? Mm-hmm. And interestingly enough, now the footprint continues to grow. And so we've had discussions with some of my counterparts that are covering the far northeast and live in Michigan. And she's like, yeah, they're even getting our hair to turn gray out here now. So it's going to continue to be a huge topic for us. And it's so fun to have an actual entomologist that's an alfalfa weevil expert that can share the same passion that I have on a daily basis.
And that can tell me why my alfalfa field last year turned completely white and not from frost.
Uh-huh.
Mm-hmm. Yep, that's skeletonization. That's what happens when larvae have had a all-you-can-eat buffet and they're really going to town.
And my yield is dropped in half and or worse. Yes. Hard lessons learned.
The crappy thing is when you can identify that pest problem at 55 miles an hour from the road.
Oh, it's way too late.
Yeah.
It is so too late.
Yeah. It's not really salvageable at this point unless you want to sell straws.
Yeah.
Or stems on the market.
Yeah.
Biodegradable straws.
I mean,
you know.
Oh. So let's talk about some of the where do we start on life cycles, growing degree, units, daily average temperatures, and then we're going to head towards economic thresholds for herbicide or insecticide applications.
Yeah. So this is a great moment to highlight an important thing about insects, right? They're cold-blooded animals. They need heat and they need sunlight in order to grow. Very similar to plants, right? And in order for them to do so, for us and our interests with dealing with this pest, generally speaking, larvae begin to emerge when day temperatures consistently get to around 75 degrees, if not slightly higher. Alfalfa weevils are invasive to the United States, and they do not like extreme heat, and they don't like extreme cold. They really are preferential pests for mild or, late spring days. So generally speaking, you can have two timings of weevil feeding. And I say that broadly. For larvae, that will be the spring. And adults can feed as well in the later fall when they begin to become more active and try and feed up before they go into their overwintering habitat and kind of go dormant. They sleep through the summer. So that's something to remember as well when it comes to dealing with this pest, is that there's a reason why you don't see them out when the average day temperature is 85, 90, 95. The adults really don't like that. So they'll go into something that is called summer estivation, where they basically just take a nice long nap for the hot months.
Man, I'm so glad that you gave us the layman's term for that estivation thing. I was under at the deep end for a second there.
It's okay. I have a personal safety flotation device for you as well. You can hand it over.
I think it's stowed under my seat. Yes, thank you.
Yep, no problem.
So now these temperature trends inform us as to when we should be scouting our fields.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and for all insect pests, scouting is critical, right? Scouting tells you when to spray, what to spray, and what you can do about it when you should do it. Now, alfalfa, unfortunately, can fall between the cracks if you're busy. I mean, we all got stuff we got to do. And being a farmer, it's even more accentuated, right? And so I'm going to take this time and say, please scout your alfalfa fields. It'll save you a whole lot of money. And it'll tell you what you can do and when you can do it. When it comes to managing alfalfa weevil larvae, right, the focus of my PhD work in the Intermountain West, because I had to organize multiple trips for multiple years and go all over from the Mexico-US border to the Canada-US border, I know them well enough to be able to generally tell you when you should start to scout. So for Southern Arizona and Southern California, I would say late January, early to mid-February. Then, of course, when you get up to Northern Oregon, so Umatilla County, Oregon, and then Southern Washington, that would be Klickitat County and Yakima counties, I would put that at early to mid-May. As to when to start to scout. When it comes to Washington, like I said, May. When it comes to Wyoming, I would put that in as May as well. Now, when you get up to Montana, southeastern Montana, I would put that at early June. Now, when you move west further into the Rockies, that date progressively moves later into the month. So Lake County, Montana, for example, I would start scouting around June 15th for larvae. Now, I'm not a proponent of, calendar spraying. I really don't agree with it, but I think calendar scouting is okay. And that'll tell you what you can do and when to do it.
And so for years, Erica, there's been a model out there that talks about using growing degree units and something about 275, 250, and then something about a 350 mark. How useful is that information? Is that credible at all? Do people still use that? How do we want to address some of those things?
I'm really happy you brought this up because it is something that entomologist perspective, growing degree days is really important for determining when to scout and when to spray. Mm-hmm. It's historically been very effective. But for alfalfa weevil, it's just not working out well. I am not a person that will tell you, lean on that fully. Follow your gut.
Right.
Like with all tools, you can only use it as well as it's made for use, right?
Well, again, I think if I'm catching you, it's still a good tool to use to get you out and tell you, okay, can we use it as an indicator when to start scouting at all, or is that still too vague to say at 250, make sure you're getting your butt out there? Do we just need to keep that scout mentality as soon as things start to break dormancy and just follow it through?
I would say you could use it as a roadmap, but I wouldn't hang my hat on it.
Right.
I know that there's been a couple of grants given by the USDA to evaluate the growing degree day model or reevaluate it just because it doesn't match everywhere.
Yeah.
And the biology of this pest perfectly.
Well, I think what's so scary about this deal as we start talking about it, folks, is that So with my other experience too of being in the alfalfa business for so long, we get into states like Oklahoma and Kansas. And if I'm not mistaken, I was at an Alfalfa U event 2 years ago, and a gentleman from Oklahoma State University, we were like the last week in February, and he had been doing treatments in his research blocks at the university already last week of February, first week of March. And at that point, I mean, we barely had things breaking dormancy, but we had weevil activity. And then I started getting text messages and little scouting updates from people in the high plains. And they're like, yeah, it's pretty common that they get after stuff in March and April. So, yeah, I think part of it is, like you said earlier, you have to get an understanding of how they interact with the temperatures and everything else in your own geography.
Right.
And don't use a broad, vague number, but it's get that local feel and then stick to it, I think, right?
Absolutely. And extension is a wonderful tool. Extension agents, they know a lot. And right. I wouldn't go away from their recommendation. They're very well-trained individuals in your community that know your farming system better than I ever could. And I think that they would be a wonderful resource for you to reach out to.
All right. We're talking about scouting here. What does that look like?
So there are a few methods of scouting, and I'm a big believer in scouting, like I said. So scouting can be done with a sweep net, but, I've definitely caught a couple ranchers with their baseball caps, metaphorically sweeping their fields. I'm not a big believer in having alfalfa weevils crawling in my hair, so teach their own. Teach their own. But generally speaking, the sweep net method is a good one. There's also something called a shake bucket method. Now, I'm not a farmer, but I can almost bet that every farmer has a bucket in their shop. At least one. And so what that method is cutting an alfalfa plant at the base and just violently shaking it into a bucket. You count the number of stems, and then you count the number of larvae in that bucket. And what that economic threshold is around three larvae per stem. Now, the economic threshold for the sweep net method is 20 per sweep. So what that means is that is the time when you are at that critical economic juncture. You need to do something. You need to take a preventative step to keep yourself from losing money and sustaining damage that you are going to be kind of dealing with or grappling with through that growing period. Now, another thing to consider is that economic thresholds are only as true if you put in the economic parameters that you're operating in, right?
Right.
Economic thresholds are supposed to change anytime there's a change in the finances. So cost of gasoline goes up, cost of product goes up or down, cost of or the value of the hay that you are producing. So there's been a paper that was published back in 2021 out of Arizona, basically saying that the economic threshold needs to be way far lower. So from that 20 weevils per sweep, I think it's down to, I want to say like 5 or 6. It's been a while since I read that paper. But that underscores that point that every agricultural system has different inputs. And so the economic model or that economic threshold has to similarly vary and be specifically tailored to you and your operation.
So I have another quick question too. Do you have anybody that has, I'm going to say this because I feel like I'm in this category. I've scouted enough fields with alfalfa weevils that I actually will just kind of gauge the shot holing effect or the feeding effect and go, yep, this is it. Let's go. Have you ever had anybody say, yeah, I don't carry a sweep net anymore. I've looked at enough fields. I just look at the percent feeding or how many stems have feeding and we go.
Unfortunately, yes, I have met a few of them. And I've also met a few people that believe in calendar spraying as well.
Oh, yeah.
And I understand the need or the, I wouldn't even call it need. I would more call it the desire for calendar spraying to work. I understand their desire for that system to work. But unfortunately, there's been enough data, right? Enough instances of that method of that timing model of spraying to know that it doesn't always work for folks.
No, that's right. I think that discussion, I'm just kind of confused that John hasn't jumped all over this economic threshold discussion and really just started dragging you down a gravel road, because that's what he loves to do.
I've been trying not to.
The all-new Krone Gen 5 Big Pack Large Square Baler gives you outstanding reliability and serviceability. The completely updated VFS makes serviceability easier, faster, and more economical. Talk with your local dealer to learn more about Krone machines built for generations.
Okay, so here's the economic side of things.
But it's real.
As the hay gets more valuable, that threshold should decrease, and as the hay gets less valuable, I'll go, well, okay, maybe you would want to count a few more larvae before you start spraying.
No, absolutely.
And then the cost of application matters. The cost of the insecticide matters, which I suspect we're going to hear about different. I hope we are going to hear about some different insecticide options to consider. And yeah, that's the economics of it. If you have something that's really, really valuable, go protect it.
And I think that's interesting how and to your point, you have commercial hay growers that are getting paid for tonnage and quality, and you have a cow-calf operator that says, you know what, things are a little tighter right now. I'm still going to have something to harvest. My threshold's a lot different than the custom hay grower and that's a general statement, and everybody I hope understands that. But when we read research papers and start talking economic thresholds, I think it's important for everybody to understand that you have your own. Here's the other thing that I've noticed is that we need to scout often. So I'm just going to throw this in there, because I can't tell you how many times in the last 10 years I've had somebody say, we were in that field on Thursday and it didn't look too bad. And when we came back on Monday, it was all over. And so just folks, you have to, as Erica said, follow those weather models a little bit. When it starts to warm up and it hits that consistent temperature of 70, 75 degrees, they're going to come on pretty hard. And you need to be ready for it. And it's not an every 5 day or a once a week type deal. It's like every 2 to 3 days in my book.
I have a story about that, actually. So I was doing some research in Bighorn County, Montana, and my crew and I were scouting every day. We had a field trial that we wanted to deploy, and we needed to ensure that we had the larval populations available to really track the impact that these insecticides had. And we had, maybe 4 larvae per sweep, not nearly the amount that we wanted. And then boom, day 5, we got hit with a tsunami of weevil. It can change like that. and it was a mad dash to the field just to get those chemicals applied so that we could actually be efficient in that work. And I think that that's something that often people don't realize, that, like a switch, they're there.
Yeah. Yep. It's the worst thing you can experience. That and armyworms are about 2 of the worst things I've seen. But
absolutely. Going back to this pest and the story of pyrethroid resistance, the history of it, and this pest species, right? Alfalfa weevil has been around in this country for over 120 years, and it's been quite impactful. For a couple of reasons, right? I don't need to run through the lines as to what they do. Most people are aware that they can damage yield, but they can also damage quality because of how they feed. What's important to realize is that we as a country have been grappling with this issue since their arrival, basically. They've developed resistance to other insecticides in the past, back in the 50s, down in Virginia. And then in the 60s, the 80s, the USDA ARS did some releases of obligate parasitoids. So these are little wasps that lay eggs inside the bodies of weevil. And that's a way to reduce the weevil populations. And they were really good in the East, very effective in the East, but not so much in the West. And it's not entirely clear as to why. And so pyrethroids came along in the 70s and 80s. And people have been leaning on them, for a long, long time to deal with this pest and to manage it. Now, when you use the same tool to kill something over and over and over again, they will adapt, they will change, they will adjust themselves to not face the same fate over and over and over again. And so this is going to lead me down to why resistance has developed, right? Pyrethroids are cheap. Pyrethroids have low toxicity to mammals. So we are mammals, right? So we are not harmed by pyrethroids necessarily. And they're highly effective. Historically, they've been very effective. But like I said, when you hit something over and over and over again with the same thing, they will change. And that's what's happened in the West. And I don't mean this to be a Debbie Downer, right? The data from my PhD shows how localized this issue is. There are still areas that have susceptibility to pyrethroids still. Pyrethroids are still effective for them to use and lean on and utilize. But for some, in very specific locations, it is a issue that is incredibly detrimental to them.
So I would like for people to hear too, if they have some suspicions that they have pyrethroid resistance in the area that they live, outside maybe of where we have the confirmations, how hard is it to try to figure out? I mean, other than people applying and going, oh, that didn't work, and let's try it again. Well, that didn't work again, so they must be resistant. Is there, what's the options for people to check that?
I'll tell you a story. It's an answer to your question, but
Fantastic.
I find that stories underscore the realities of folks better than a dry answer. And that is, there is a rancher, he's still in operation, and he sprayed pyrethroids 3 times with no effect. And what's the definition of insanity? Trying the same thing over and over and over again and expecting a different result. And I think that once you get to that point where you're spraying a pyrethroid 3 times in the same year and you're not seeing any impact, you have resistance. I mean, you're there. You are that train has left the station and it's time for you to deal with it. There is a point in time where you are between the extreme ends of that spectrum. Pyrethroids work and pyrethroids don't work. And it's all about trying to maintain that resistance to as low as you possibly can, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Now, I've only been to like 1,000 different pesticide recertification credit talks, and there's always something to be said for pesticide rotation using different modes of action. Do we have that ability?
Yes. It is limited though, and I think this is a beautiful conversation to have right now because of a couple of points. Mm-hmm. One is that Lore's ban is being rolled back. I think they're trying to push out as much of the stock that they have already, but I don't think they're making much more of it. And pyrethroids, it's a mode of action group 3A insecticide, and it is the predominant mode of action group registered for forage alfalfa production. So if you have resistance, I mean, that's about half of the chemistries you have available. Spinosad is a suppressant insecticide. What I mean by that is a suppressant insecticide, the standard is 70% mortality. For a registered chemistry that's supposed to control a population, the standard is 90% or higher. And spinosad is much more expensive, so I wouldn't necessarily recommend it. And it's also registered for organic application, hence why it's so expensive in part. And so when you look at it, the chemistry that really rises to the top is indoxacarb. It's a mode of action group 22A. And the reason why I keep on talking about mode of action groups and I list their numbers out is so that to underscore the fact that you have to track it. Just because an insecticide has a different name, has a different active ingredient, if you don't change that mode of action group, you are still impacting the insect the same exact way. You're not diversifying. You're still using the same chemistry, basically, in essence. There's slight differences, but how the insecticide impacts the insect remains the same. So you want to change that.
If we're concerned about these particular groups with the pyrethroid resistance, is there any benefit to mixing different groups together to try to avoid it, or do we just use one group at a time and rotate around? What's the general recommendation on that? Does it help?
I'm really happy you bring this up, and I cannot I don't think there's a right answer here. I can tell you my preference, and I'm an insecticide purist. So I'm a believer that if you're going to use an insecticide, you need to know what you're spraying, right? Mm-hmm. And it's easier to rotate when you only spray one mode of action at a time, because then you're not putting that pressure on that population over and over and over again. Now, there's something to be said, right, about tank mixing and putting down multiple insecticides. Maybe you have an insect complex that requires a certain insecticide to be sprayed because the concentration of whatever it is that you're spraying for weevil is not enough to knock them down. And that's totally understandable. But it's important to note what that mixture is, so that that second insecticide that you're mixing in with a pyrethroid, right, isn't reapplied the next year too.
Sure.
Yeah, that's something to bear in mind as well.
Well, and I think the other thing that we've had discussions about before is if we have multiple pests in the field at the same time, and we want to try to make sure that we have good efficacy on all of them as well, that then you have to kind of be really watching labels and because it's not one size fits all. Some of these chemistries don't work on all the insect pests that we might have in an alfalfa field. So you really have to be diligent to say, okay, weevils, aphids, maybe leafhoppers at the same time. How do I get that? It's a science, right? It's an art to get that right.
It's a nasty one. I'll tell you what, and it's a hard one to get right. And that, I'm going to circle back to this. Lean on your extension agents. Lean on the folks that are that can get to your field, that can help coach you through that problem, because it's very easy for me to sit back in my office in Nampa, Idaho, not understanding the full complexity of your operation, say, oh yeah, spray this, spray that, it'll work just fine. No. The person that can be boots on the ground for you will have a whole lot more insight for you in your operation than I ever could.
Well, and sometimes I advocate for grower education too, because it's very common for me to get these frantic text messages or phone calls where a guy's like, oh my gosh, I'm out cutting and my cutter bar's just covered with bugs. Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you. Which bugs do you have? All of them. Okay. Now, what the crazy one is when we have like those ladybug larvae out there, and they look like little purple monsters with orange dots on them, right? And they're like, oh my God, the bugs are horrible, and we got to spray right away. And you go, whoa, do you realize how many beneficials are on that cutter bar right now? And they're going to eat, 10 times their weight in aphids today? Just go back to the cutting and forget about it.
Yep.
Well, especially if you're at the cutting stage,
right?
Because the harvesting process is pretty hard on those aphids.
No other square baler has a bigger appetite for the most demanding conditions than Krone HDP2 Big Pack. 8 knotters put more hay on every bale, and a new V-knotter design makes hanging on the bell hook almost impossible, requires fewer adjustments, and leaves no scraps behind. See it all at krone-na.com. Krone machines built for generations.
Yeah.
So anyway, now I migrated a little away from it, but my concept was make sure you understand which bugs you have so you can help.
And that's something to consider as well, right? I mean, chemistries have different impacts on beneficials. So one of the things to consider as well is what chemistry you're applying and how it enters the body of the insect. So pyrethroid insecticides are considered a generalist insecticide because the insect just has to come in contact with it in order for it to be effective. There's a reason why this works so well. So one of the issues with a pyrethroid is that it impacts your desired pest species, right? Alfalfa weevil, for example, but it also impacts your beneficials. So one of the issues, especially down in Arizona, for example, is that if you spray a pyrethroid, you knock down your weevil population. That's great. But guess what? Your aphid population is going to balloon because you don't have that persistent beneficial population in-house that can really clean up and maintain their populations at a low level.
I think that's pretty common. We see that in a lot of fields where we get the weevils under control and the aphids are right behind them. So,
and it's important to remember too that aphids are a really tricky beast to get out of to manage. They're basically born pregnant, so they can really balloon really quick, populationally speaking, and that's something to bear in mind and consider as well. Pyrethroid resistant aphids have been recorded in the north central region of this country as well. And so, so when you think about the diaspora of pests and the diaspora of chemistries and where they intersect, that's when things can get real crazy real quick.
And so the other thing that I wanted to try to talk about too, which just escaped my mind because I saw a squirrel run through the yard or something. I wanted to talk through a little bit. So we've talked about chemistry to control, but let's talk about some of the other. That's exactly
where I was going to go.
Other methods or what are some other things we can do other than just throwing more chemical at the problem?
Yeah.
Because I think we both have some fun examples and stories there. So I'm going to open that can.
The go-to, or at least there's two strategies, and I'm going to dive into each one for a little bit. One is harvesting early. So that's a mechanical control strategy. The other is grazing. That's a form of biological control. So mechanical control, harvesting, 7 to 10 days before normal harvest. Depends on where you are. Not everybody believes in this, but it's still being a recommendation to help diversify that management strategy like we were talking about. Really change it up, really try and not put that consistent pressure on that population, chemically speaking. You want to diversify as much as you can. What can you do, right? If you're worrying about the impact of early harvest on your alfalfa, on your tonnage, early harvest will ensure that you have great quality, but not everybody's looking for fantastic out of the park quality. Some people just want bulk yield. One thing to consider with early harvest is to rake as soon as you can. Really dry out that leaf material as soon as you can. Really try and push that weevil population to low numbers. Really try and kill them with your machinery, please. And another thing to consider is, of course, it's a very effective method if you have hot, dry weather, right? If you have high humidity, maybe it'll take longer for the alfalfa stand to dry or the harvested material to dry out. And that's not necessarily going to work real well because guess what the larvae are feeding on? Yep, they're feeding on that regrowth. And so that's when you start having that streak, that defoliation, that frosted look of your field that John was mentioning at the top of this segment. Mm-hmm. And you start seeing these streaks. And that's just the larvae feeding under the windrows. And I've seen that myself in a couple of spots in the West where they just didn't clean up, didn't rake as soon as they could, didn't take care of business. And that obviously kicked them in the pants because they had that defoliation. They sustained that damage.
And we take these machines today and we're taking 9 to 18 feet of material and putting them in a windrow behind a swather. And literally we concentrate that weevil population under that windrow as well. So it's one of those, that's how I started my career with my first weevil discussion. Was the guy called and said, man, I got my hay baled off and I'm just not having regrowth. There's these streaks all over the place. Yeah. And it's like, well, take an aspirin and call me tomorrow. I said, well, go do an application and call me in 3 days. And the green up was fantastic, but you have to be able to scout that. And I talk scouting again. If you pre-scout before you cut, so you kind of know what's going on before you gather all the buddies in a party spot, it helps your thought process too of what actions do I need to take once that cutting is done and the hay is removed and we get on to business. But Yeah, it's a phenomenon that we get photos every year.
Right. And this is actually a really great time. This is a great time for me to bring this up, right? The traits that you have in your alfalfa can really matter when it comes to determining what you can do. So harvesting early, like I mentioned, really is great for quality if that's what you are, trying to optimize, but it does do damage to your yield, right? You're not going to get the tonnage that you're hoping for on your cut. And what can you do to recoup that? So like Harvextra treated alfalfa is a great trait to have because it allows you to extend that harvest window and recoup that yield that you have lost due to harvesting 7 to 10 days early. So that, I think that's a really good avenue to consider as well. And spraying, going back to insecticides, spraying insecticides often coincides with first cut or is pretty darn close to first cut. Alternatively, right, if you have Harvextra treated alfalfa, you can extend that harvest window out a couple days so you don't have that residual when you go in to harvest as well. So it's an important balancing act. So bear in mind what traits you have in your alfalfa. Keep a good, notebook handy so you know what you have and where you have it. And then you kind of have more flexibility to manage it.
Yeah. And even the other thing, Erica, that went rolling through my brain was if you understand which fall dormant alfalfa you have planted 3, 4, or 5, that can also help you make some of those management cutting decisions on which side of the window to go from a quality standpoint as well. Paired with the Harvextra piece is fantastic.
Exactly. I'm going to transition into the other management strategy, which is, of course, grazing your field. And that's not going to work for everybody because you need high traffic tolerant alfalfa. Cows weigh a lot. When you have a whole herd of them out there in your field, that can damage the crown of your alfalfa as well. And so what does any guesses from you and John as to why grazing your cows on your alfalfa field can be really beneficial from a weevil management standpoint?
So, John, I'm going to give you the first stab at this because I'm ready to roll.
I got nothing on this one. You notice I've been really quiet because I just know so precious little about all of this. I live in a place where the wind hurts my face all winter. So I tend to think that we have fewer insect problems. So, yeah, I'm just going to be quiet and listen.
So she made a comment earlier about oviposit by the females.
Oh.
So the female is going to do an oviposit into the stem of that alfalfa plant. And when you have residue in the field, I love using this as an example. If you have a lot of residue in the field, you have 3 apartment complexes with 157 units available because there's a lot of places to put people. And if you have very short stubble or they've done their oviposit and the cows go graze it, what happens to the eggs? Boop. No more apartment building. We're down to a one-room schoolhouse, right? So if you take that residue away, whether it's before they deposit potentially or after they deposit, there's not as many places for eggs to hang out. So that's my answer.
That is the right answer. Good job for that pop quiz. Crushed it.
Maybe I've talked about that once or twice. I don't know.
Yep.
Clean up your fields is what I just heard you say.
So here's my funny, so Erica, I love telling stories as well. So I got 2. So one story. We always talk about people leaving residue to catch snow, insulate, all these kind of things. And a lot of people do a very good job of that. I had an example of a guy that sent me a picture of a alfalfa field along the highway. A stalled car pulled off, stalled, started on fire, and the fire burnt out through the alfalfa field. If you can imagine just this weird pattern out there where the alfalfa burnt before it got put out. The next spring, when that greened up again, there literally were virtually no weevils left in that patch where the residue is removed. So I'm not telling people that we're going to have a broad slash and burn program to burn alfalfa fields, but the principle of removing that situation is pretty real. And another scenario where we had alfalfa, same variety, fence line between 2 fields. One field got cut late, let's call it a sacrificial October cutting, and the other field left residue over winter. And when we watched the scouting process in the spring, the field that had no residue left literally did not need to be treated in the field that was full residue. All the apartment houses were in full capacity. We had a treatment issue in that field. So again, this whole thing about residue management, it's crazy how much that matters. And sometimes it's about the hoof traffic to smash stems, smash eggs. I know there's been some sheep grazing studies as well from some of the northern states that say, yeah, it's a nice percentage reduction. So go ahead.
I'm learning. This is wonderful.
It's fun.
It is fun.
Because for some of us, like yourself, Erica, the research projects that you got to scout how many acres and work on those. And just, I should have started keeping a journal or something at one point, because I've been doing this for literally 22 years now with a sweep net, and be interested now to figure out how many acres I've scouted with weevils in them.
I did a tally. So when I finished my PhD, there was so I'll tell you a little bit how I did it. So went to fields, collected weevil, counted hundreds, if not thousands of weevil, and put a set number in a vial, and then scored how many were alive and how many were dead. And so when I say that I had Excel spreadsheets on Excel spreadsheets, I literally, truly mean that. And so when I, like with all good, interviews with potential, job postings and stuff like that, they like to see numbers. Well, I kind of figured that my PhD defense was a great version of that. So on my final slide, on my PhD defense, I listed how many field sites I went to. And believe me, it was like 100, close to 150, if I'm remembering correctly. How many glass vials I put product into. I believe it was, I want to say, let's see, 150 times 10, if not more. Yeah, I'd put it around 50,000. And then when it comes to the amount of weevils I have killed in a bioassay standpoint, I definitely broke 100,000. And so when I say that I'm an entomologist, I'm very good at killing insects. I'm a insect serial killer.
That's fantastic. Erica, we have talked before in other conversations about, so if we know that we've been using pyrethroids, there's this neat rotation schedule that you have, and this idea that if we rotate away from it for enough years to a different group. Anyway, I don't remember the numbers, so I'm going to let you finish my story that I helped you start.
Thank you so much for bringing this up. There was a ranch, Bighorn County, Montana. I mentioned it before. I identified that it had an extremely high level of pyrethroid resistance. And when I say pyrethroid resistance, I don't just mean one active ingredient. I mean all type 2 active ingredients. So that is lambda-cyhalothrin, zeta-cypermethrin, alpha-cypermethrin, and beta-cyfluthrin. I know for folks...
Whew, that was lots.
is very important. So lambda-cyhalothrin is the active ingredient of Warrior 2. Zeta-cypermethrin is the active ingredient of Mustang Max. Beta-cyfluthrin, I'm trying to remember, is the active ingredient of Brigade. When you go to the store and you're trying to buy product, all of those would not work for you. And so this rancher was really without tools in his toolbox for pyrethroids. Now, what we determined was that with a high degree of resistance to pyrethroids, indoxacarb insecticides still work. So indoxacarb is the active ingredient of products like Stored, where they basically, different mode of action, different method of killing the insect, they work great. Now, he used Stored for 4 years straight, and we consistently deployed the same field trial every year, and we were able to track regained efficacy. Not immediately, but I'll tell you what, from the beginning of my PhD to the end of my PhD, so 4 years later, what we were able to see was that his degree of resistance to pyrethroid dropped from high, where nothing worked, to a moderate degree of resistance. And that changes the game entirely. So when it comes to a high degree of resistance, right? You spray pyrethroids 3 times within the same year and you're seeing no impact whatsoever of this insecticide on this pest species. Well, move on to another mode of action group. That's all I can really say. And use that mode of action group for 4 or 5 years. And then take like the back 40 or take, some low yielding acreage and dabble with pyrethroids again and scout that treated area and see the impact of pyrethroids on the weevil population that you're trying to manage. And if you're seeing regained efficacy, if you're seeing that they did do a good job or good enough job, then you can start rotating it back in. But that's what Jeff was mentioning earlier about rotating and diversifying. So I would say do not repeat an application of pyrethroids multiple years in a row. So if you spray, let's say spring of 2026, you spray a pyrethroid. Don't spray it spring of 2027. I would spray a different mode of action group insecticide, like indoxacarb, for example. And then on year 3, so 2028, I would spray something else or graze or harvest early or do something other than going back to a pyrethroid or going back to indoxacarb products. Because when you do, you're putting that selection back in. So it's all about diversifying that selection pressure that you're putting on that population. And then if you're susceptible, right, pyrethroids are working great, you have no issues, all you see is rainbows and butterflies, good job, but pyrethroid resistance can still develop for you if you lean on them too much, right? And the same thing goes with any chemistry. And so diversification is the name of the game.
And I think that's what we need to do and what we want to do. So we love these tools that are in the toolbox. So to enable us to continue to use them so we don't have, the horrible yield losses and quality losses that we get. We have to be quote unquote stewards of the game to make sure that we can all use these tools for a long time. So.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And unfortunately, we live in a world where it takes a long time to develop new chemistries. My background has been in insecticides, right? Crop protection. And it takes, decades for new chemistries to go through the hoops to be able to be on the shelf, right? I think that we are at a time where we need to be able to conserve the chemistries that we do have. And the best way that we can do that and maintain that is by rotating.
Known for greater throughput even in the heaviest crops, Krone Big Packs are the world's fastest large balers. With proven bale quality and increased density over other brands, Krone Big Pack balers are the right choice for optimized productivity. Talk with your local dealer to learn more about Krone machines, built for generations.
I want to ask a question around proximity, where you're talking about resistant populations. If you have a resistant population in one field, a mile away, you have a different field that's not been in alfalfa, that's been in canola or winter wheat or something that's not as susceptible to alfalfa weevil. Is that, and you plant that field that's a mile away to alfalfa, is that weevil or population going to be resistant?
That is a great question. And I know I've talked to Jeff about this in the past in previous chats that he and I have had about this issue. I think the important thing to underscore here is how different agricultural production looks depending on where you are. And what I mean by that is there are sections of this country where it's a monocrop system. You're seeing the same field, same crop, time and time again. And there's a couple examples of this for alfalfa specifically. The Bighorn County, Montana, Sheridan, Wyoming drive right there along the Bighorn Mountains. That valley is pretty consistently alfalfa. Now, the Columbia River Valley, that is also pretty consistently alfalfa too. Now, they do have other crops. They do have other,
potatoes, corn, all sorts of different stuff. Yep.
Yeah. But the truth of the matter is that because it's basically homogeneous, you have alfalfa field touching alfalfa field, and that you have edge habitat, and you have basically a full thousands upon thousands of acres of ag land in use with alfalfa. I have seen entire valleys develop resistance to pyrethroids. And a lot of it has to do with that proximity to fellow alfalfa fields, but it also has to do with that edge habitat, with the, I guess, how friendly the landscape is for an insect to move. Now, that whole thing changes when you go down to the southwest, when you're in the deserts, the Sonoran deserts. What I mean by that is that you have an irrigated alfalfa field, and then you have desert or shrubland, just dry land in general. And so resistance has to develop separately. It's a lot harder for these insects to move freely when they have to stay cool, when they have to find water, where it's not as convenient or friendly for them to move. And I think that that's something to consider as well.
I wanted to ask one more question too. Are there other hosts that these weevils can live on, so that maybe it's not always, if you have a short rotation in between alfalfa fields, if there's a host where they can kind of hang out for a year or two and stick around?
That's a great question. And to answer it, not to our knowledge. And when I say our, I mean to science's knowledge. Now,
Right.
That's not to say that in the wintertime, adults don't hang out on certain plants and aggregate. But what I am trying to say is that we don't know what that plant is. We don't know what their secondary host may be. But what we do know is that they only oviposit in alfalfa. They only put their eggs on alfalfa. Their larvae only feed on alfalfa. So what the adults do, we kind of, it's not to say that we don't care, but it is to say, we kind of, it doesn't really matter.
It's
right?
the egg placement.
We're still going to come back to alfalfa anyway.
Yeah. What I also just heard you say is crop rotation is a control method too then.
It can be.
I mean, if you're not in an area where it's a solid stand of alfalfa for 10 miles, if you just have, Jeff's been up to my timber country here where my fields are miles apart, and we'll rotate to a cereal crop for a couple of years, I'm reducing the weevil pressure.
You're not providing a habitat for the eggs to be oviposited in.
Correct.
That's not to say
that it's not happening somewhere.
That it's not happening somewhere else.
Yeah.
It's just to say that the adults are finding somewhere else to go.
Sure.
If that makes sense. What I was going to say is that when it comes to dealing with pyrethroid resistance, it's if your farm is the only one that's rotating mode of action groups, is the only one that's diversifying control strategies, that the impact of that effort is going to be diluted if your neighbors aren't doing the same thing. So, and this is a challenge. This is a challenge of a many. It's not a challenge of a singular person, right? And so, weevils do move. Adults have wings. They're not great flyers, but they can fly. And so if your neighbor is only putting down pyrethroids and they are selecting for that resistance, but you're trying your best to kind of remediate that, those adults may still come back into your field and still be bringing in that resistance to it. That's not to say that your efforts will go unnoticed or unappreciated or will have no impact whatsoever, but it is to say that I would strongly recommend that it be a team effort.
You almost need your local ag supplier in on this and just not offer Warrior for a whole year.
Yep.
It's definitely
do something
a
else.
Good discussion. Yeah. Yep. I'm glad you made the winged adult comment, because I'm one of those people that moved into a community where I couldn't find an alfalfa field for miles. Mm-hmm. And I planted my first stand. Establishment year, we were good. First full season, problem already. So they do move. Hadn't been alfalfa within 4 miles for as long as people could remember, and I had them within the second year. So they're around. Don't think that just because it's the first time you've ever had it that you're not going to get them. So scout, and scout frequently.
Yep, exactly. Like I said, it's like a light switch. They don't show up, and then they show up.
I want to say thank you so much to Dr. Erica Rodbell and Mr. Jeffrey Alfalfa Jackson. Mr. Jeffrey Alfalfa Jackson. Boy, Alfalfa's not just his middle name anymore. It's turning into his name. Thank you both for sharing with us today and having a good discussion. I have learned so much, and we have things to fix in my operation now. And I suspect there's going to be a few folks going, all right. If they want to find out more information, where could they go? Whether it's University Extension or maybe FGI has some external publications.
There's a couple researchers that are entering this space. I am not the only one, or I may have been one of the first, but I'm certainly not the last. There's two that I know of, and they both have my protocol. Iowa State is dabbling in it, but I don't think that they're doing comprehensive research. But their extension entomologist, Dr. Aaron Hodson, is on board and is aware of this issue and is tracking it. Anthony Hansen up in Minnesota, he's an extension there. He's the person that identified, one of the people that identified pyrethroid resistant soybean aphids, and now he's dabbling with pyrethroid resistant alfalfa weevils. They all have my protocol. I wouldn't hesitate to watch this space and see how it develops, because we have a lot of good entomologists aware. I'm sure that they'll be coming up with new methods of managing this, new strategies, and data that is more attuned to your respective agricultural systems.
Well, again, thank you both very much. And I always enjoy visiting with the folks at FGI and Cropland. So thank you very much.
John, it's been a pleasure. Thanks for putting this on for everybody to learn, buddy.
Yep. Happy to do it.
Thank you.
Alrighty. I'm going to do a little bit of an outro here, but it's just my usual.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you to my audio crew, Nick Palmieri at Palmieri Sound. Without him, none of this would be possible. And thank you to Jessica Palmieri for doing our social media coordination.